This is Rock and Roll English. Real people, real English. Here's your host, Martin Johnston.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll English. Episode number 261, baby. Oh yeah, despite the fact I still have a cold, we are back to a podcast every week. And this is the week where it's the turn of, let's say, a podcast with another podcaster. And I speak to Stephen from English with Stephen. Makes sense, doesn't it? And this is probably the most interesting podcast I've ever done, okay? Because normally I talk to people like Dan the Man, Corporal Coma, okay? They are not interesting people, but Stephen is, because he actually knows stuff, like real stuff, interesting stuff. And he tells us about the history of the English language, how English used to have genders like masculine, feminine, and why it doesn't anymore, where the words hello and goodbye come from. Sorry, that wasn't meant to happen. Did you see how my voice was just going there? Where the words goodbye come from? So let's try to get back on track. He also tells us why English is the world's language, the influence Polish has had on English, and many more interesting things. And speaking of interesting things, don't forget to buy the ebook with 25 amazing stories written by the RnR family and edited by me. Stories from all around the world. Fantastic stories. Remember, all of the money is going to help families that are trying to keep safe and leave Ukraine, because unfortunately, as we know, it's not a good moment over there. I am actually going to do an episode all about this ebook later in the week, but in a few words, the ebook is amazing. There's also a podcast version, a private podcast you can listen to when you buy the book. It only costs €10. You also learn English because there's lots of grammar and vocabulary. It's for an amazing cause. You will be helping people and feel like a great person. So just bloody buy it. There is a link in this podcast you are listening to right now. So stop the podcast and buy it now. So pause the podcast now. Okay, good. Have you bought it? Excellent. Okay, let's carry on and get back to this interesting podcast. The first time Rock and Roll English has ever been interesting. Here is the conversation with Stephen. Happy listening. So, hello Stephen, and welcome to Rock and Roll English.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on. You're one of the people I've been keeping an eye on, thinking, he looks interesting for the podcast. So happy to finally have you on. So obviously I know a bit about you because I follow you on social media and see what you do. But for the listeners that maybe haven't heard of you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, my name's Stephen Green. I come from the city of Birmingham in the middle of England. But I've been teaching English for about 25 years, and for the last 15, 16 years I've been living in Brazil, and the last 11 years in the south of Brazil in the city of Curitiba. I teach online, I teach privately, and I have a podcast for English students called English with Stephen. Very creative name. And that's, even the website is englishwithstephen.com. So everything is English with Stephen.
Yeah, I have noticed there are a lot of these. English with Lucy, English with Michael. I think that I'm missing something. I don't know why everyone went for that name, but I went for a different name.
I wish I'd gone for something different.
Right.
Yours is eminently memorable. Mine is just English with, and when you go into Google, you do English with, you get hundreds of things. It's like, I should have thought about that a bit more, but I didn't do it yet. So.
Well, I have got a grammatical error in the name of my title with the apostrophes. So
okay.
So I know how you feel. But your podcast is particularly interesting because you have many things. You kind of look at the etymology or like the history behind words, don't you?
Yeah. Basically, I do three different things. I try to talk about the history of English, to talk about why English is the crazy language it is, and my students like that when you can tell them, oh, we do this ridiculous thing because of this. It's like, oh, okay, fair enough. I talk about learning strategies, how to learn English. But what I really like doing is etymology and word stories. I call them word stories. Where do words come from? How have they changed over time? Things like this. And I like telling stories, and students tend to like listening to stories. So
absolutely, that's what rock and roll English is all about, stories.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really think that helps you remember the word.
Totally.
Once you know where it comes from, it helps you remember it a lot. And one of your podcasts, speaking of knowing words, is exactly that. So what does it mean to truly know a word? So tell us, what does it mean to truly know a word?
Well, for me, if you truly know a word, you know everything about it. So it's not, there are meanings. You've got your denotation. That's what it says in the dictionary. But you've also got connotation. Is it a positive connotation, a negative connotation?
Yeah.
But there's other aspects. There's the grammar of the word. How do you use it in the past tense? The word family. How do you change it into a noun? What's the opposite? The pronunciation of the words. How is it used in collocations and expressions and phrases? There's so many aspects of a word to truly know it. Now, I'm not saying that students need to know all of these things, but it's like a checklist of things that you can ask yourself, questions to ask yourself when you're trying to learn new vocabulary.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially the grammar around the word, I think really helps. Like maybe if it has a preposition after it, what preposition, depends on, for example. And lots of other things on your podcast really interest me. So, for example, genders. So, obviously, lots of languages have genders, like the only foreign language I speak, Italian, has like genders. Some words are masculine, some words are feminine, but English doesn't. And why not? I actually don't know the answer, so I'm waiting for you to tell me.
Quite a few of my episodes are about the Vikings and the effect the Vikings had on English culture and specifically English language. And there's two theories about why we don't have gender, but they're basically linking to the Vikings. So when the Vikings invaded into North England, their language was similar to the Anglo-Saxons. We're talking here the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century. Their language was similar because they're both Germanic, but the endings were different. And so what it seems happened was that the two language communities understood the root, the main part of the word, but didn't understand the endings of the words. And so they just stopped using them. They stopped using the masculine. English had three. It was masculine, feminine, and neuter, like German. And they just stopped using them because it just confused things. And that happened with other things as well. There was lots of declensions for nouns and verbs, and we just stopped because it was just much easier to talk to each other. There's a linguistic idea as well that English tends to have the stress at the beginning of a word. Not always, but it tends to come at the beginning. And so the last syllable is often weak or unstressed. And so it just disappears over time because it's not really necessary. So those two things playing together meant that we just stopped using genders.
Well, that is very interesting, and I think as well a very intelligent decision. I don't know if it was one person in particular. Well, I imagine obviously it happened over time, but I like to think there was one person that just said, "Look, we don't need the end of these words," because, for example, for me in Italian, even now, it's still a disaster. Sometimes I think, is this word masculine or feminine? Because everything changes. I have to change the article, I have to change the adjective, and it's just a bloody nightmare. So I think if anyone from the Italian government is listening, if you could make a decision to get rid of the end of these words, that would make it a lot easier for people like me. Same here.
Portuguese, and this is a shout out to the Portuguese government, the Brazilian government, please, it's not necessary. It really isn't.
It's not. It just creates so much confusion.
But at the same time, that the Vikings simplified that aspect of English, but they are also largely responsible for phrasal verbs. So, you win some, you lose some. So
absolutely, yeah. Also, so we have to thank them for the absolute nightmare that is phrasal verbs. Although if it weren't for phrasal verbs, I don't know if I would have a job, because that's
This
what
is
most
true.
people want to learn.
Yeah, those prepositions, man.
Yeah. And so obviously now, well, the main reason English, I suppose, is important is not to travel to an English-speaking country, but because it's like more or less the language of the world now. If you travel to places, more likely than not, you're going to be speaking English. But why is English the world's language? That's another one of your episodes, and something I'm interested in.
Well, it's interesting because 100 years ago, English didn't look like it was going to be the world's language. French was much more widely spoken. And that was with the British Empire. Yeah, the British Empire was starting to decline, but the British Empire still covered a lot of the world. So basically, it was the United States in the 20th century. It was a convergence of lots of things. You had technology, which made the world smaller, faster communication. The United States had the economic power, also the soft power with universities, Hollywood, rock and roll all around the world. And people just needed to learn English if they wanted to have access to things like this. But also globalization, that English was in the right place at the right time,
right,
because of the United States and the British Empire provided the foundations. But English was in the right place at the right time as the world got smaller. And if it had happened 100 years earlier, it would have been French. If it happened 100 years later, it might well have been Chinese or something else.
Of course.
But it was just in the right place at the right time. It's nothing to do with it being simple. People say, oh, English is much easier, much more functional. Nah, it's not. It's nothing to do with that. It's the soft and hard power of economics, the military, and globalization all happening at the same time.
Right, okay. So I often make fun of some Americans, and especially one of the American guests I regularly have on. But now I will tell her that they have been useful for at least one thing. Then
totally, yeah.
And again, giving me a job.
Absolutely. There's a lot of problems with the United States, but they gave us a job. They keep us in work. Yeah,
exactly. So I have that to thank them for. And speaking of the United States, so there are obviously quite a lot of differences between it essentially is one language, but the way they speak English and the way we speak English. For example, we say holiday whilst they say vacation kind of thing.
Yeah.
But why is there this difference? This is another one of your episodes.
Well, there's the natural differences. Until recently, you had this geographical distance between the two countries. Mm-hmm. Now, with modern communication, that distance is much smaller. But any language, when they separate for a long time, they develop differences. So you've got this natural difference. And it's not just languages. You get accents changing when people are separated for any period of time. But also it was a political decision in the United States after the United States gained independence. Noah Webster, the dictionary is still named after him, he wanted to simplify the spelling and make it an American language to show political independence and identity, which was separate to Britain. It's always been one of the easiest ways to create a national identity is to have a national language.
Of course.
England did this during the 100 Years' Wars between England and France. The aristocracy used to speak French. But those wars between England and France, they started to speak English to create this national identity.
Fuck you then.
Oh yeah, the fight that the soldiers were going, why are we fighting for you when you speak the same language as them?
Yeah.
And so the aristocracy, the kings and the lords, started to speak English to differentiate themselves from the French. So
wow.
And we see this all over the world, that people, when you get a new nation, they try to get their own language, even though it's often similar to another language. It's one of the easiest ways to create a national identity. So you've got the natural distance, but you've also got a political decision by Noah Webster and people who supported him in the United States after independence.
Right, wow. And again, I must give credit to the Americans here because their spelling does work better, I think.
Totally.
It does make more sense.
It's much more logical. Noah Webster he wanted to go even further, and he was working on another dictionary to really simplify the spelling. But he died before he finished it, and then the dictionary was bought by another company and they never completed his project. So it could have been much easier to spell English.
Right, okay, wow. Even some of the words, for example, we say the pavement whilst they say the sidewalk, which I think that just makes so much more sense, the sidewalk, because pavement essentially is all of the road, not just the side bit where pedestrians can walk.
Well, yeah.
It doesn't seem to make much sense.
In Portuguese, when you talk about pavimento, you're talking about the whole road, the process of paving the whole road. Yeah. But those words came in when the economies of both countries were booming, but we had the maximum distance between Britain and the United States. So all the words about cars, they're totally different. Because that was the beginning of the 20th century. We didn't have fast communication, and so it took a long time for words to come from the United States to Britain. And we were able to create our own words, and they embedded in Britain. Nowadays, if there's a new word in the United States, it's in Britain within seconds on TikTok and stuff like this, and we can pick them up very quickly. So there isn't this time for a British word to grow and an American word to grow at the same time.
Yeah, right. Wow. This really is I always say on this podcast, every day is a school day, but
absolutely.
I feel like today is like a whole week or 2 weeks of school at the same time.
Live and learn.
Absolutely. And another thing, especially I think for this podcast, which will be interesting, is I saw you had an episode about words from Polish, because I know we have lots of Polish listeners that have made their way into English. So obviously, people can go to the episode, Stephen's episode, to listen to the whole thing and find out all the words, but just give us a couple of examples of words that we have stolen from Polish.
Well, yeah, I lived in Poland for a year, so I was able to...
Right, wow.
I wasn't very good with the Polish language, but I did pick up vocabulary. And some of them are food. One of my favourite types of food from Poland was borscht, which is a beetroot soup. Absolutely delicious. And then there's pierogi, which is like a type of pasta with a filling inside. But one of my favourite words from Polish is spruce. And that is a Polish word that means from Prussia. And the word went from Poland to England, and England had this idea that things from Prussia were better quality, especially leather. There was a leather goods called spruce. And so today we use the word spruce. I'm going to spruce up my bedroom. I'm going to make it look better.
Yeah.
I'm going to spruce up my clothes. I need a new wardrobe. So this word spruce came from Poland to mean literally from Prussia, and we use it nowadays in many different contexts. It's one of my favourite words from Poland.
It is a good word. Well, it's a good word in general, I think. Because like you said, it's got that thing, like you said, to like spruce up. It's a nice sound as well. It is just a nice sounding word. There are some words which they just sound nice.
Totally.
I often say my favourite word in English is smooch because of the meaning to it means to kiss someone, but even just the sound, it just I don't know, it's just got something about it where I think that's a bloody good word. And
the sound describes what you're doing.
Exactly.
I do like that word. That's a particularly good one.
That's a good word. And another title which grabbed me was English grammar is wrong. Now tell us something about this, because obviously there are many things which don't make sense, but what do you mean that English grammar is wrong?
So again, we go back to the 100 Years' War, which is in the 13th, 14th centuries in England. And before that, French was the language of government. French was the language of politics. And even in universities, academia is French or Latin. After the 100 Years' War, now everyone's speaking English. But English was seen as a language of the field, of the countryside, of the peasants. It was not a sophisticated language.
Right.
And so they decided, we need a grammar for this language. And so the clerics and the professors in universities, they sat down and decided, we need to write a grammar. They all came from a Latin French background. And so what they did was they superimposed Latin grammar onto English. Latin and Greek were seen as the ultimate in languages. They were logical, and everything was measured against Latin. And so they took the Latin grammar, put it onto English. The problem is, English is not a Latin language. English is a Germanic language. And so there's lots of names for things that we have in English that the grammatical names, they just don't make sense because they don't really describe how English works. We need a whole, just things like the past participle. What does that mean for English? It doesn't help. It doesn't talk about the past. The past participle can be used to talk about many things.
Of course.
But also the grammar names, the verb tenses, the past tense. We use it to talk about the past, but we can also use it to talk about the future. We can use it to talk about many things. We can use the present continuous to talk about the future. I am visiting my parents next week. That's the present continuous. But we're using it to talk about the future. So we need a whole, I think we need a whole, and there are different ways of describing grammar, but the one that we have is just so traditional, it's very difficult to break it.
Yeah, right. Wow, yeah. And yeah, exactly that. Once, when I have like beginner students and, you do the present continuous, like in this moment, I am talking to you. And then when you start telling them that you can use that for the future, their minds are just bent. Yeah. They're like, what the fuck is this? Yeah.
So we should call it something different. There should be a different name for it. And there are some good books out there. I'm trying to remember them now. I can tell you later. There are some good books which describe the grammar the way it's really used and not the way some Latin academics wanted it to be used. It's a difference between prescribing how it should be used and describing how it is used.
Right, okay, yeah. And the thing you mentioned about Latin, so many English words I have now learned through my knowledge of Italian. Right. Because there are so many words, like those Latin words, that, are kind of seen in English as, like, if you use them, you're kind of like a sophisticated kind of person. Yeah. Which we don't really use so much. I remember, for example, even this quite a few years ago, seeing the word lament, which means to complain, obviously. Okay. And I was like, oh, right, so that must mean complain because that's what it means in Italian. And so many of these that I found.
Some of my Brazilian students, especially the more advanced ones, they have a problem because they use all these Latinate words and they do sound overly formal. Brazilians are not normally overly formal, but when they use a Latinate word instead of an Anglo-Saxon word, that they do sometimes sound a little bit too officious sometimes.
No, I have exactly the same thing. And so another place where language comes from apparently is the Bible. As you said, most people probably haven't read the Bible. I've read a bit of it from my time at school where they made us read the Bible every Tuesday in reflection time, it used to be called. But even then, I kind of was just looking at the pages without reading it. But so tell us what language comes from the Bible then, obviously just a little bit.
Well, there's an incredible amount of language which was originally written in the Bible. It's not that it was created by the writers of the Bible, but it is the first time that we have it written down in the Bible. And the first thing to say is that there was a lot of people didn't want the Bible to be written in English for various reasons, because it would give people. The priests at the time were the gatekeepers, and they could control what was going on if the Bible was written in Latin. But also people who were writing the Bible maybe had a different interpretation. And we can see later that you get the Reformation in the church because of this part of it.
That's a big job. People have asked me to translate some things before from Italian to English, but translating the Bible, that's a big job, isn't it? Like, I would be like, this is quite a lot of pressure to translate this.
The official Bible, the official translation was done by a committee of different people. But it drew heavily on one person, Wycliffe, who did it about 100 years before. But that was unofficial, and the books were burned. There's only a few copies remaining. And he was not ostracized, not kicked out of the community completely, but he was separated from the rest of the society. So The official one was by a committee. They had lots of people doing little different parts. But there's things like a broken heart. This comes from the Bible. The first time we see it is in the Bible. By the skin of your teeth. Or when somebody bites the dust. Eat, drink, and be merry. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Pride comes before a fall. Man does not live on bread alone. It's not that they are individual words, but it's more phrases. And anybody who speaks English, who grew up in Britain or the United States, they will be using a lot of biblical terms, a lot of biblical phrases, even if they've never opened the Bible, never been into a church, because they have entered into the English language.
Yeah, right. Wow. I think as well the Freddie Mercury and the band Queen have to thank the Bible for Another One Bites the Dust.
Yeah, a whole song just from the Bible almost. And another person who owes the Bible a lot is U2. If you go to songs like I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, it's full of biblical language. There's lots of language in there that comes straight out of the Bible.
Right. Also, great song to help with the present perfect as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Lots going on in that song. And another very international word is okay. But I was actually, I must admit, quite surprised when I went to Italy and they used that. I was a bit like, because my knowledge of foreign languages when I moved to Italy, I think was below zero. And I was quite surprised. So where does that come from then?
That comes from the northeast of the United States, and it was a joke. It was an in-joke amongst a small group of educated young Americans in about the 1860s, I think. And they just used it as a joke. They had lots of words that they changed the pronunciation, and that was one of them, and it just caught on. And I think it caught on. It became popular because it's so easy. Okay, there's just two sounds, two syllables, and it's not just Italy, it's the whole world uses something very similar to okay.
Wow. I mean, that really has spread then. I've got a few stupid words I use with my friends, but none of them have caught on, as you say. So that means obviously to become very popular. Okay, so the last one, I suppose, to finish before we say goodbye is hello and goodbye. Where do these come from? And I just must also say, this is in Italian, they have ciao to say both. I mean, there are other ways to say hello and goodbye, but like in an informal context, that's the most common one. So I have had many students in the past get these confused, and it's the strangest thing, like when you're leaving and then they're waving to you, they want to say goodbye, but they're actually saying hello. And then at that point as well, it's always like, well, I want to go now, so I don't know, and I often never corrected it. So sometimes I think many people never actually learned, because I was like, I do need to go. I haven't really got time now to explain the difference. So I would find myself waving, and then I would think I'll tell you at the beginning of next lesson, and then I would forget again, and then at the end of the lesson again they would say to me hello, and I was like, oh God, I'll do it next lesson. And it was just in a repetitive cycle, and they never learned. But so where do these words come from?
Well, goodbye is again another religious word. It started as God be with ye. Ye was an old word for you.
God be with ye. Right, yeah, of course.
So it became God be with ye. Over time they changed the pronunciation. Again, God be with ye, God be ye, God be good. And then God became good. And so it became goodbye over time. It just took a long time. And each stage there was a little change, a little change. And eventually it became a goodbye.
Right. And I noticed as well, even good seems to be going, doesn't it? Lots of people just say bye.
Bye-bye.
So maybe in a few hundred years, the good will be gone. I noticed this as well, especially moving back to England, how, when people say good morning, the good is going now. People just say morning. And I just kind of think, well, I know it's the morning. Are you just telling me it's the morning? You just see someone that says morning. Yeah. And I'm like, I know it's the morning.
Yeah. Evening. instead of good evening. Yeah,
it's just like describing things. I could like if I just come up to you and just say like I don't know like bottle. It's like if I've got a bottle in my hand, doesn't make any sense.
Totally. Yeah. So hello is a little bit different. Hello wasn't really common until recently.
Right.
We used to have other words to say hello. We used to say hail. We still have this idea of hail Caesar. And hail is associated with like health. So good health to you and stuff like this.
Right.
And another word that we used was holler.
Holler.
Which but in the 1800s, the late 1800s, hello became more common. It had existed, but it wasn't really as a way to say hello. It was, and we still have this idea in Britain today. It was more like a surprise, sort of like, well, hello, what do we have here? And that was the original meaning, to greet something in a surprised way. But then with the telephone, when people started using the telephone, we needed a standard way to greet on the telephone. So Alexander Graham Bell, one of the people who maybe invented the telephone, he wanted to use ahoy, which we still use for ships.
I like that. Yeah,
that would be good.
I might start saying that would be great. Yeah, ahoy.
Yeah. But for some reason, people just started to say hello on the telephone. I don't know if people were surprised when they started using the telephone, but that just became the standard way of answering the telephone. And then it just spread from the telephone into general use.
Right. Okay. Wow. Again, with Italian, they say pronto, which means ready. And I always found that quite funny because I kind of like interpreted that like I'm ready for a conversation. Like as you answer the phone, just pick up, I'm ready. Like, okay, good.
Traditionally, traditionally they said the same thing in Brazil. They don't use it anymore. It's you hear it occasionally, but traditionally it was pronto when you answered the phone.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Wow. Well, this has been a real education, but obviously we've only just touched on like many of the things you cover in your podcast. Obviously, you have many other interesting episodes as well. So tell us where we can find out more about you.
Okay. So my website is English with Stephen, but I spell Stephen STEPHEN. That was my dad's idea, not my idea. That confuses everybody. So it's englishwithstephen.com. I'm also on Instagram, English with Stephen, Facebook, English with Stephen, Twitter, I think is English with Steve. But if you do English with Stephen for any of those, you're normally able to find me very easily. Yeah.
Well, I'll put links to all of this in the show notes anyway.
Great.
So, thanks a lot for your time, Stephen, and keep making great content, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been great talking to you.
No problem at all. Okay, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Okay, so that was me talking to Stephen from English with Stephen, and as I said, it was bloody interesting, wasn't it? Because he actually told us those things in a non-boring way. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Remember to check Stephen out. All of the links to his stuff will be in the show notes, which is rockandrollenglish.com/episode 261. Remember to buy the ebook. If you've got to this point in the podcast and you still haven't bought it, shame on you. Okay, I will talk to you all again very soon, but in the meantime, just keep on rocking, baby.
Thanks so much for listening to Rock and Roll English. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit rockandrollenglish.com and facebook.com/rockandrollenglish. We'll catch you next time.